Hello everybody. If you're just joining us, I'm Code for Broke, part of a two-member game development crew. I'm the lead programmer and artist, but I'd be nothing without my creative partner, Biker Crank. And he's really more the ideas guy behind the whole operation. Yeah, the two of us have been working on this game for a while now, when we're not busy scratching our skin and digging holes in the yard. It's inspired by games like Kenshi and Dwarf Fortress, along with insomnia-induced paranoid schizophrenic delusions, the sort of secret sauce that makes it all special. Now, last time we built a system to generate a grid of chunks and save them to the disk. Then we created some classes to manage loading and unloading chunks as the player moved across the world, creating the illusion of a single continuous map. Here's a look at that world when we left it last time. And I know what you're thinking, Code for Broke, you handsome devil. Your world generation is perfect already. And if we were developing Starfield, you'd be right. We could package this soulless gray blob and ship it. But we haven't really achieved a truly open world yet, since all we're really doing is saving and loading meshes and throwing colliders on them. And the next stage, saving and loading characters and items, is going to be a giant pain in the ass. So I took a break to make things slightly prettier before we get to all that. I started by dusting off the old HLSL, that's a high-level shader language by the way, and took my first crack at a little water shader. I moved the vertices up and down and figured, hey, this is pretty much there. Then I figured I'd use depth to change the opacity of the water, and that was a bit of a waking nightmare with some interesting results. But eventually I had something halfway serviceable, and I decided to set it down for now. In the future, I'd like to pour a lot of time into this and make the water something special, with believable waves, foam, buoyancy, so characters and boats can float and swim. Then we can do fun stuff like add pirates and sea monsters. But for now, this is at least clear enough to illustrate the point that we're not looking at land, which is what I set out to do. Next, I modified the terrain generation to always decline below sea level along the edges, and then placed a flat plane with our water shader on any chunk with a point below a certain threshold. Finally, I dragged the old ground texture from the test environment we've been staring at for the last year and a half, and voila! A world, more or less. It's not quite as thick and succulent as I'd like it to be, but hey, you should see what Rust's game world looked like when they restarted development in 2015. It's all up from here, folks. Now for the real issue, serializing and deserializing items and players. And I'll tell you why that's a problem. See, this game started as a prototype, and the player and the items were among the first things I ever added. Combined with the fact that I'd never considered serialization in the context of game development ever before in my life means the code, as it exists now, is not at all suited to be saved and loaded at runtime. The world chunks were extremely simple. They just hold a collection of data we can reuse to build a mesh. But characters and items are complex. They've gone through multiple iterations throughout development. There's values that don't make sense anymore, or were created for a system that's not in use. They have a bunch of different stats to handle combat, animation, AI. There are status effects, a set of limbs which themselves have their own stats, and items assigned to them. Some items have a percentage they've been cooked, prefix and suffix modifiers generated at the time they were created, and all this information has to communicate with an animator and a limb controller that reflects the state of those stats. All of those things were swelling in the code base as I tacked on small feature after small feature, until eventually we got to where we are now. Trapped, alone, afraid. Realistically, I could have kept kicking this can down the road a while longer, but instead I decided to roll up my sleeves, take some black market performance enhancing medicine, and untangle the web I've woven. The results were thousands of lines of code being rewritten, a bunch of old junk being removed, and at long last, inner peace. Shalom. Now a few more words on serialization. Anytime we're transferring data, as a rule of thumb, we'd like to move as little of it as possible. Items and characters are unique from terrain chunks in that they have a lot of data that's repeated between them, which comes from what is more or less a template for the type of character they're based on. We could, if we were an insane person, serialize every single aspect of the character and items and call it a day. But what would be the point of saving the same sprite image thousands of times when the game already has a copy of it? Really, what we want to save is the delta between the character and the template they were generated from. Then we set up a loader to handle resetting the shared variables we didn't bother saving at the time the character is deserialized. And here we can see just that in action. We can spawn a bunch of items on the ground and move the player far enough away to watch the chunk get removed from memory and then reloaded again. Now we're seeing why a bunch of stuff suddenly appears and falls to the ground, sometimes shaking violently in Skyrim when you load a new area. There's some tricks we can employ to mitigate this effect, but in the context of the open world, these things will always be out of sight for the player, so we don't need to worry about it until we have a reason to. I wanted to stress test this a bit with hundreds of items, and it held up pretty admirably. The frame rate drop comes mostly from all the physics objects we're creating, and not so much the save and the load. There's lots of optimizations we can look at there too when the time comes. And of course we have it working for NPCs as well. But unfortunately, there's a lot of work we have to do to get the AI to play nice with the new world generation. So for now, I'm just cloning the player character in a mob with no AI controller attached. Just to be extra sure it's working, we can cut off some pieces and test the chunk loading there too. Great. The blood isn't being saved and loaded with the chunk, but it was designed in such a way that it could be. However, I'd like to take a crack at some better looking and better performing gore in the future too, so I'm not going to touch this just yet. That's it for now. I'll probably stay on this subject for the next time as well, getting the nav meshes generated for the AI and some more details to the terrain. Oh, and I made a Patreon, by the way. There's nothing on it. As usual, thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you made it this far into the video, go ahead and subscribe, or don't.